Hi, this is Joe, and this is the second video on building molding for e-bike fenders. So we're going to build some tooling here, and then we're going to pull some carbon fiber parts from these from the molds. So what we have here is we have a piece of shelving, and I like to use the shelving because it has a nice smooth finish. So there's 4 coats of wax. Happen to use what I have lying around, which is some Mother's Carnauba wax. I'll put a link into some other paste wax that you can use that are especially for a mold release. One is called Part All, and there's a link on Amazon. I'll put that in the description. So both the shelf and the plugs have been coated in 4 coats of wax. I like to use several different kinds of mold release. I've had problems in the past with parts sticking. So I like to use a good paste wax, and then what we're going to use is a product from Stoner, and it's a thermoset mold release. So I like to use several different mold releases because, again, I've had trouble with parts sticking in the past. So what we have now is we have everything waxed 4 times. I'm heating up my hot glue gun, and then what we're going to do is we're going to hot glue the plugs down onto this this shelving, and then we're going to leave a flange, a space for a flange all the way around, because what we want is on the molding or the tooling, we want a nice flange so that when we vacuum bag it, and then also for the flange, if we have any extra carbon fiber ply left over, it can be bonded to the flange, and it makes removal of the part from the mold much easier. So let's go ahead and hot glue these parts down. We don't want them moving around when we're actually putting the gel coat and the fiberglass down. So we're going to hot glue these down, and then we're going to put some clay around the edges. When you're building up your mold with fiberglass and resin, you don't want any resin to get underneath the crevices underneath the part. Otherwise, the resin will come in and grab underneath in these cracks, and then you won't be able to release the molding from the plugs. So we'll go ahead and do that here in a sec. We're going to hot glue some hot glue on the bottom of the plugs. You don't need a lot, just enough to get a good surface, and again, leave yourself some gap for the flange. Then we'll go ahead and let that tack up, and that way it won't move around when you're putting the fiberglass plies on top of the plugs to make the mold. We can then do the same on the front plug, the front fender plug. Again, leave yourself plenty of room for the flange. After the hot glue sets up, then it's going to be, these parts will be pretty firm, and then we can laminate over them. Again, also the wax on here, if you do get any strands of hot glue, it's really easy just to wipe right off because of the wax on all the surfaces. So we have those. Let's let them set up here and cure for a minute. Now we're going to get some clay, and we're going to do a nice tapered radius around both plugs. Again, we don't want any resin getting underneath in the cracks. I'm also going to build up a small, nice fillet of clay at the rear section of the plugs. That way we won't have any sharp edges. When you're laying down fiberglass does not like sharp edges because it does not conform to the sharp edges. So we'll be building up some clay, and again, when you pull the part out of the mold, it won't matter because we're going to take and trim off the carbon fiber part from the tail section. So let's go ahead and get some clay, and we'll give this another minute or so to tack up, and then we'll put some clay around the plugs. Pick up yourself some clay tools and make sure that you save the clay because you can reuse it. So here I'm just filling the clay into the crevice underneath the part. Work with the clay with your fingers to get it warm, and then that way it will spread easier. And just slowly work your way all the way around the plug. And you want a nice fillet all the way around. So what this is called is a positive draft angle. And whenever you're making tooling, you always want to make sure you have a positive draft angle. That means you have a fillet moving away from the part. If you have a negative draft angle, then resin's going to get underneath and lock onto your plug, and you won't be able to remove it. So always have a nice fillet so you have a nice positive draft angle. We have all the plugs filleted with clay, and notice I've built up the back portion with a nice radius. Make sure after you're done with your clay, you take a rag and you clean all the surfaces of your plug and the board to get as much clay off as you can, because that's your mold release surface. So what I'm going to do is right before we start laminating our fiberglass, I'm going to take and put another coat of mold release on top, and that way I'll make sure that I have a proper coating of mold release on the plug and the mounting surface where our flanges will be. So let's go ahead and mix up some resin, and let's start with the gel coat. We're going to make some gel coat. I'm using epoxy resin. A lot of people use polyester resin, but I can get a gallon of UV epoxy resin for a little bit less than I can get a gallon of polyester tooling resin. So I make my own gel coat with some dye and some Cabasil fine powder, and then after that we'll start laminating up the gel coat and let it tack up, and then we'll start in with our plies of fiberglass. Okay, we've cleaned up the mold surface. Now I'm going to put some of this Stoner thermoset mold release, and the directions indicate that you lightly spray, not too heavily, over the entire molding surface. So let's go ahead and do that now, and then we can start doing our gel coat. When we made the foam plugs, we made the plugs out of XPS foam, which stands for expanded polystyrene. So I'm going to be using an epoxy resin system. If you use a polyester resin system, a polyester resin system contains a polystyrene. So if you use a polystyrene resin system on a polystyrene foam, it's going to dissolve it. So that's why I'm going to use the epoxy. So, and we're going to use, I have some System 3 general epoxy, so I'm going to be using that for the gel coat. Let's move over to where I do my measuring, and I'll show you how I'm going to mix this epoxy up.